All authority derives from the ultimate and supreme authority of God, our Creator, ruler, and judge of the whole world. This truth is not a welcome thought in general, as it runs directly counter to the values ruling the flesh, the world, and the devil. The flesh wants to rule itself. The world wants to rule itself. And the devil wants us to bow down to him and believe the lie that it is in our own interest to rebel against authority and do whatever we think is right. Remember that the devil was able to deceive and convince Adam and Eve that rebelling against the commandment of God was good, that it was a good thing that would make them their own rulers, being like God. But the truth was the opposite. Yes, they asserted their self-rule, but instead of life and wisdom, they obtained death and corruption, and became slaves of the devil, and slaves of their now corrupt nature. Christ became man and manifested his glory in order to undo the works of the devil. And this means that our salvation involves more than the forgiveness of our sins. It also implies the restoration of all things, the restoration of our freedom to submit to God's rule, to submit to God's commandments out of love and thanksgiving, recognizing him for whom he really is, our God, and his commandments for what they are, what is really good for us. This implies, as Paul has said at the beginning of chapter 12 of Romans, a transformation of life which begins with the renewal of our minds and continues through the offering of our whole lives as a living sacrifice, pleasing to God through Jesus Christ, testing and learning the perfect will of God as it applies to every aspect of our lives, every detail of our lives. The rest of chapter 12 of Romans deals with the application of this principle to our lives, first as members of the body of Christ, with a series of particular exhortations and examples of how we are to treat each other. And immediately follows after with chapter 13, which is the epistle lesson for today, the fourth Sunday after Epiphany. This is the famous chapter in which Paul addresses our duty to submit to the higher powers that have been ordained by God for our good. But I want to highlight the fact that this chapter, chapter 13, is actually a continuation of the exhortations which began and were laid down throughout chapter 12. In verse 17 of chapter 12 we read, "Recompense no man evil for evil. Provide things honest in the sight of all men. If it be possible, as much as lies in you, live peaceable with all men. Dearly beloved, avenge not yourself, but rather give place unto wrath. For it is written, Vengeance is mine, and I will repay, saith the Lord. Therefore, if thine enemy hunger, feed him. If he thirst, give him drink. For in so doing thou shalt heap coals of fire on his head. Be not overcome of evil, but overcome evil with good. Let every soul be subject unto higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God." You see, there's a continuity between the exhortations ending chapter 12 and the beginning in verse 13. Paul moved from an exhortation regarding our duty towards one another as members of Christ's body in the faithful administration of our gifts and talents in each other's service to address the subject of our duty towards the corrupt and sinful world surrounding us. How are we to interact with it? The overall idea, the guiding principle of this exhortation is that we are to always overcome evil with good. Paul knows the world well and knows that conflict, suffering, and adversity cannot be avoided upon this fallen world. Yet he makes it clear that the faithful Christian is never to initiate conflict by giving offense. As Paul says in verse 18, if it be possible, as much as lies in your power, live peaceably with all men. In this we are to imitate Christ in his dealings with sinners around him. Jesus took the cross. He suffered offenses without ever responding in kind. We, on the other hand, are ready to reason that an offense committed against me or against us naturally justifies a reaction in kind. If you yell at me, I can yell at you back. If you hit me, I can hit you back. If you steal from me, I can steal from you, and so forth. This reasoning is natural and obvious to the mind of the world, but it is contrary to the gospel of Christ. The Lord commanded us to take the cross and follow him. This means that we are to deny ourselves and not procure our selfish good and sinful pride, nor justify our sins in the faults of others committed against us. In fact, Paul in these verses is simply reasserting and applying what the Lord himself had taught us in the Sermon on the Mount, where we read in chapter 5, verse 38. You have heard that it has been said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say unto you, that ye resist not evil, but whosoever shall smite thee on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if any man will sue thee at the law, and take away thy coat, let him have thy cloak also. And whosoever shall compel thee to go 1 mile, go with him twine. Give to him that asketh thee, and from him that will borrow of thee, turn not thou away. The law concerning an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth was a rule given in the law of Moses, designed to teach judges the important principle that penalties ought to fit the severity of offenses in judgment. Jesus here was not contradicting this principle or the teaching of the law, but it was rescuing the letter of the law from being interpreted against its spirit, that is, its divinely inspired purpose. The dictum of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, taken literally by an ungracious spirit, can be easily turned into a justification for private retaliation, in which one feels entitled to take justice by our own hands. That is, we can twist the law to use it as a justification for actions of a vindictive temper, which is unwilling to forgive others for anything. Instead, Jesus teaches us that the opposite ought and is to be our attitude. We are to have an attitude of patience, long-suffering, forgiveness, and generosity, illustrated again by the Lord's expressions that, taken literally, are suitable of leading us to transgress the spirit of the law on the other direction. Let me explain. When Jesus taught us to turn the other cheek, for example, he did not mean to tell us that we must commit to pacifism and renounce the principle of self-defense. Pacifism is the ideology which defines violence or the use of force as immoral in all circumstances. And many pacifists derive their position from reading passages like the one we just quoted. But there is a problem. The literal interpretation of Matthew 5:39 runs counter to the teaching of Scripture on this subject in many other contexts, including Romans 12 and 13, as we will see. For example, John the Baptist did not tell the soldiers who asked him, "What shall we do?" to drop their weapons and quit their jobs. He told them, "Do not take money by force or false accusation." He said, "Be content with your wages." In other words, be good soldiers and do not abuse your power, but be content with your salary. Yet, some people interpret Jesus' teaching to conclude that all use of violence is evil by definition and imply that the use of force, even in self-defense, is inconsistent with the spirit of the gospel. But this is not true. Jesus never forbids the use of violence in every circumstances or spoke against self-defense. For example, Jesus taught the disciples to flee from one city to the next when persecuted. He also told the disciples to be wise as serpents while meek as doves, because they were sent as sheep in the midst of wolves. He did not say, "Let the wolves eat you," but be clever and meek, so that we may overcome the evil of the world with good. Furthermore, by the end of Jesus' ministry, on the night in which he was betrayed, Jesus told the disciples that they would need swords. In Luke chapter 22, verse 35, we read, "And he said unto them, When I sent you without purse and scrip and shoes, lack ye anything? And they said, Nothing. Then said he unto them, But now, he that hath a purse, let him take it, and likewise a scrip. And he that hath no sword, let him sell his garment, and buy one. For I say unto you, that this that is written must yet be accomplished in me. And he was reckoned among the transgressors, for the thing concerning me hath an end. And they said, Lord, behold, there are two swords here. And he said unto them, It is enough. This incident not only tells us in passing that at least some of the disciples had swords, but also that Jesus himself foresaw their need to be armed and well supplied of money in order to face the difficult times ahead. If Jesus had been a pacifist, he would not have given these instructions, but would have rather told the disciples to leave their purses and their swords behind, so that they would be defenseless against the attacks of the world. He did not do such thing. Finally, we also have the record of how Jesus responded when he was smitten that very night later on by an officer during his trial. In John chapter 8:22. And when he had thus spoken, one of the officers who stood by struck Jesus with his palm of his hand, saying, Answerest thou the highest priest so? Jesus answered him, If I have spoken evil, bear witness of the evil. But if well, why smitest thou me? You see, Jesus did not turn the other cheek to be hit again. And this shows that Jesus did not mean the turning of the other cheek as a rule to be taken literally, forbidding self-defense. But as St. Paul explains at the conclusion of chapter 12 and chapter 13, as a correction against the spirit of personal vengeance. We are to live in this world in peace with all men as much as it is within our power. But in a fallen world, evil will occur. Yet we are to overcome evil with good at a personal level, renouncing vengeance, because we live in a moral universe where God provides for this judgment to be duly exercised. God is in charge of retributive justice, and moreover, he has placed in this world authorities with the power of the sword to punish evil doers. Be not overcome of evil, but overcome evil with good. Is followed by Romans 13:1. Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that they ordain, that be, are ordained of God. Whosoever therefore resisteth the power, resisteth the ordinance of God, and they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. Wilt thou then not be afraid of the power? Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise of the same. For he is the minister of God to thee for good. But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid, for he beareth not the sword in vain. For he is the minister of God, a avenger to execute wrath upon him that does evil. Paul here clearly recognized the validity of the lawful exercise of violence in the punishment of evil by God-given authority of those placed as his servants in positions of ruling power. And this principle here applies not only to government and kingdoms, but also to families and any other form of structure in which the rule of law is placed in the hands of a head, authorized by God as his servants, like parents in the family, teachers in the school, and pastors at church. And remember, Paul wrote chapter 12 and 13 to the Romans when Nero was emperor of Rome, and while Rome was still a thoroughly pagan state. Yet this was no hindrance to recognize the fact that all authority comes from God and therefore is ultimately accountable to him also. Like in the case of soldiers, the solution to abuse of their power was not the elimination of their function or the elimination of their power, but the correct use of the same. And the same is true in every sphere of authorized power. Anarchy is not the solution to tyranny. In the middle of these two streams, we have this God-given submission to lawful authority. There is a place where it is possible to abide in peace, submitting to the authorities God has placed upon us, as they lawfully exercise their God-given function. So that both vengeance and rebellion are both contrary to the Christian profession, due to the fact that the sovereignty of God guarantees that evil will be overcome by good at every level in the world to come, and in the meanwhile, we are to learn to live faithfully, placing ourselves willingly under authority, recognizing that laws and powers, in spite of their imperfections and failures, are necessary in a fallen world and a sign of God's divine care and rule over us. May God grant us his grace, that we may so live in this world, that at the end we may enjoy the blessings of his eternal kingdom, for his honor and glory. Amen. Let us pray. O God, who knowest us to be set in the midst of so many and great dangers, that by reason of the frailty of our nature we cannot always stand upright, grant to us such strength and protection as may support us in all dangers, and carry us through all temptations. Through Jesus Christ, our Lord. Amen. Remember the words of the Lord Jesus, how he said it's more blessed to give than to receive. Whatsoever ye would that men should do to you, do you even so to them. For this is the law